"So this is what it feels like to be invisible," Bradley said, smirking across the table as if he had written the rules of the evening himself. The room filled with polite laughter that felt more like a blade sliding across my chest than amusement. Claire's laugh joined in, sharp and rehearsed, and I realized at that moment she wasn't standing with me anymore. Not really. The chandelier light caught the glint of her emerald earrings, the same ones she wore at every corporate gala, and she tilted her head just enough to signal approval of his words. I adjusted my tie, kept my expression neutral, and let the sound wash over me, letting it settle like ice in the marrow of my bones. I had driven through the streets of Chicago for hours, listening to the rain bounce off asphalt, watching the city lights blur through my windshield, and now, sitting in this grand ballroom, with white linen stretching under chandeliers the size of small cars, I realized all the years I had believed in quiet support had been a mirage. The floor felt solid beneath my polished black shoes, yet every heartbeat reminded me of how unstable everything had been. The waiters glided past, champagne flutes in hand, their movements smooth, practiced, unaware of the storm brewing at the center of the room. Claire's posture was perfect, her smile radiant, the kind that spoke of a woman at ease in her domain. And yet in my mind, I cataloged every movement, every glance, every whispered comment that might hint at weakness. I sipped the whiskey I had poured myself in silence, feeling its warmth spread through me, and I remembered the early mornings, the nights spent planning logistics in empty offices, the decisions made behind closed doors that no one had seen, that no one had appreciated. Here, in this ballroom filled with the laughter of people who thought they understood me, I held my secret close, letting the surface of calm mask the current of intent flowing beneath. Bradley leaned in again, voice laced with mockery, asking how it felt to have a wife whose success dwarfed my own, expecting me to shrink, to bow to the narrative he had crafted. Claire laughed again, not a note of sympathy, just a reinforcement of his authority in her eyes. I did not move, I did not speak, but internally, a sequence of calculations unfolded, recalling every encounter where I had been underestimated, every decision that had seemed small, but was in fact a cornerstone of influence quietly amassed over years. The ice in my glass caught the light, fractured like the facade of the evening, and I realized that the joke, the laughter, the apparent humiliation, was only as powerful as the knowledge they had of the board of control, of the quiet authority I had cultivated. I traced the outline of the chandelier with my eyes, imagining the fall of each figure in this carefully constructed hierarchy once the truth emerged. I reminded myself of the slow, deliberate steps that had brought me here, the emails, the contracts, the quiet investments that made me a player unseen until tonight. The room seemed to shrink around me with the weight of expectation, the collective assumption that I was powerless, and I let that assumption hang, like mist over a frozen lake. I allowed the narrative to run its course, observed every twitch of Claire's hand, every tightening of Bradley's jaw, noting the exact moment when confidence would falter and realization would dawn. I was not here to shout, to rage, or to make scenes. I was here to remember, to wait, to record the patterns that would serve the ultimate reveal. Every flash of light from crystal glasses reflected back my patience, and every polite chuckle echoed in the silent chamber of resolve I carried inside. The evening stretched, a series of carefully measured beats, each one marking the slow drip of tension, the layering of emotional revelation that would eventually allow the tables to turn. I allowed myself one thought, steady and unyielding. Patience is power, and the first laughter is never the last word. I did not answer Bradley because the wrong answer would have given him what he wanted, and the right answer would have ended the evening too early. There is a particular kind of man who mistakes silence for weakness because silence is the only language he has never learned how to use. Bradley Cole was that kind of man. He wore confidence like a rented tuxedo, loud enough for people to notice, tailored enough for people to believe it belonged to him. Across the table, he leaned back with one arm draped over his chair, laughing at his own cleverness before anyone else had time to decide if it was funny. Claire stood beside him, one hand around the stem of her champagne glass, her wedding ring catching the light whenever she moved. I watched that ring more than I watched her face. It had always been a small thing, a circle of gold I bought when I was still driving a used Chevy with one working speaker and a heater that needed 10 minutes to wake up in winter. Back then, she had cried when I put it on her finger. Tonight, it looked like part of a costume. The ballroom at the Blackstone hummed around us, full of soft jazz, expensive perfume, low executive laughter, and the clean clink of silverware against plates that cost more than some families spent on groceries in a week. Everything looked polished. Everything sounded civilized. That was the trick of rooms like that. They could turn cruelty into entertainment as long as everyone held a glass while it happened. Claire touched Bradley's sleeve and smiled at something he whispered. I did not need to hear the words. I had already read enough of them. 3 weeks earlier, her phone had lit up on our kitchen island while she was upstairs changing for a dinner she told me was with the regional leadership team. I was not looking for secrets. I was looking for the plumber's number because the dishwasher had been leaking again, slow and steady, the way bad things usually begin. Then Bradley's name appeared, followed by a message preview that made the room go cold around me. Not romantic. Not dramatic. Worse. Casual. Mocking. The kind of message two people send when they have already agreed who the joke is. I did not open it. I did not need to. A man can survive a lot, but sometimes one sentence on a glowing screen tells him exactly where he stands in his own home. After that, I began noticing everything I had trained myself to ignore. Claire angling her phone away at breakfast. Claire laughing in the garage before taking calls in the driveway. Claire correcting my shirt before company events with the same expression someone uses to wipe dust off a shelf. I told myself not to become small. Suspicion can shrink a man if he lets it. So I became precise instead. I checked calendars, expense lines, public records, board filings, internal notices that most employees never read and most executives assumed no one outside their circle would understand. Bradley was messy because arrogant men often are. A resort charge entered under client development. A private dinner listed as vendor outreach. A department transfer request buried after a young analyst complained about being pressured to alter numbers. Nothing explosive by itself. Nothing loud enough to shake a building. But together, the pieces formed a shape, and once I saw that shape, I could not unsee it. Claire was not just laughing at me. She was standing close to a man who had built his confidence on other people's silence, and she was helping him stay comfortable inside it. That was what changed me. Not jealousy. Not pride. Not the little insults Bradley tossed across tables like spare change. It was the recognition that the woman who used to know my heart had learned to respect a performance more than character. I looked down at my phone beneath the tablecloth. One message waited on the dark screen from Marcus Bell, my attorney and the only person in that building who knew why I had really come. Everything is ready. For words. No decoration. No emotion. Just a door, unlocked and waiting. I slid the phone back into my jacket pocket and let my hand rest there for a second, feeling the folded copy of the acquisition summary against my palm. Walker Holdings had not appeared overnight. It had been built the way I built everything worth keeping, quietly, one decision at a time, one signature after another, with people underestimating the man in the plain navy suit because they could not see the structure behind him. 90 days earlier, our fund had secured controlling interest in Meridian East through a chain of purchases clean enough to pass under the usual gossip and strong enough to move the board when the hour came. I had given Richard Hayes 90 days to fix the rot. He smiled through every warning, nodded through every report, and protected the same people who made his quarterly numbers look good. Men like Richard do not ignore problems because they cannot see them. They ignore problems because the problems are profitable until someone makes them expensive. Bradley raised his glass again, his voice getting louder now, fed by Claire's laughter and the approval of men who thought volume was leadership. He asked if I needed help finding the parking garage after dinner, because a place this nice must be confusing for someone like me. A few people laughed. A woman near the end of the table looked down at her plate. Richard Hayes gave a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. Claire watched me with a look I knew too well, half warning, half embarrassment, as if my quiet presence was the only thing threatening the perfection of her evening. I could have told them then. I could have put the truth on the table between the salad forks and the champagne flutes and watched the blood drain from their faces. But power revealed too early becomes a tantrum. Power revealed at the right moment becomes weather. So I smiled, small and calm, and lifted my glass just enough for Bradley to see that his words had not landed where he wanted them to. The music shifted softer. Rain tapped against the tall windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. Somewhere behind me, a waiter laughed under his breath at a private joke, and for one strange second, the room felt suspended, like the whole night was holding itself above a crack in the floor. Claire leaned close and whispered my name through her teeth, telling me not to make things awkward. I turned my head slowly and looked at her, really looked at her, at the woman I had once trusted with every unfinished part of myself. Her eyes were bright, beautiful, and patient. She wanted me to stay manageable. She wanted me to absorb the humiliation neatly, like a good husband, like a quiet accessory, like a man grateful to be allowed in the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not embarrass her. I simply nodded once, and in that nod, something inside me stepped backward from the marriage and closed the door without a sound. I remembered the first time I had walked through the doors of Meridian Freight Systems as a young man with nothing but a vision and a set of blueprints scribbled on napkins from a diner off State Street. I had been 25, impatient, unaware of how much time it would take to make the kind of mark that survives scrutiny. Claire had been with me then, laughing at my optimism and rolling her eyes at the endless hours I spent calculating routes, costs, and schedules. That laughter had been warm, encouraging, part of the rhythm of a partnership built on trust and shared dreams. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, a distant memory wrapped in sepia tones, yet they had shaped me more than any contract or purchase order ever could. In the years since, the company had grown beyond anyone's expectations, a network of distribution centers, warehouses, and logistics routes spanning the Midwest and reaching the East Coast. I had stepped back quietly, letting others take the limelight while I ensured every foundation was solid, invisible yet present. The meetings I attended now, the emails I received, the briefings with analysts and legal advisors, all confirmed what I had known for months. The infrastructure I built was still intact, even if Claire had forgotten the man who had built it. The past few weeks had been a study in patience. I traced the flow of reports, the subtle shifts in responsibility, the way people deferred unconsciously to the directions I had left behind. Bradley thought he had mastered the room with his loud voice and sweeping gestures, but he had missed the way the cogs of this system still moved according to my original design. Each step he took, each joke he made at my expense, only underscored how little he understood. I recalled late nights with Marcus Bell, the attorney who had first taught me the importance of layered planning and quiet observation. Together we had reviewed filings, contracts, and subsidiary agreements, ensuring that the control I held was secure, even as the world around me assumed I had disappeared. It was this quiet control, the accumulation of years of deliberate choices, that made my current presence in the ballroom potent beyond measure. As I observed Claire leaning into Bradley, smiling at his commentary, I was simultaneously there in the past and present, remembering her excitement when we had first won our contracts, her pride in the first truck that rolled off the lot with our name painted on its side, and her admiration when the first warehouse opened without a single misstep. All of it had led to this moment, her laughter serving as a reminder that she no longer aligned herself with me, and my silence marking the calm before revelation. I had learned to read microexpressions, subtle body language, and the cadence of speech that revealed intent. I noted the tension in Bradley's shoulders when he thought his joke landed, the slight stiffening of Claire's hand when she realized I had not reacted. The chandeliers overhead cast fractured patterns across the marble floor, and in those patterns, I saw a visual echo of the calculations running through my mind. Every misstep, every overconfident glance, every indulgent smile created a map of opportunity. My hand rested lightly on the leather of my chair, fingers brushing the seam, feeling the weight of the information I held in reserve. No one in the room suspected how deep my knowledge went, how precise my plans had been, how quietly I had prepared for this convergence of public humiliation and strategic timing. The jazz music softened, the clinking of glasses became background texture, and I allowed my mind to replay decades of experience, folding them into a coherent narrative of observation and preparation. I thought of the board meetings that had shaped corporate policy, the minor negotiations that had established long-term control, and the legal agreements that would allow me to act decisively without raising suspicion. Every piece of data, every human reaction, Every subtle sign of misalignment was cataloged and stored mentally, ready to be applied when the time was right. I did not fidget. I did not glance around anxiously. I did not give any hint of the storm of certainty building beneath my calm exterior. I was in control because I had always been in control, just as I had been 20 years earlier when every contract, every shipment, and every decision had been mine to manage. The room, the people, the laughter, the soft lighting, and the perceived chaos were all elements in a play I had already scripted. And so I waited, observing, measuring, feeling the subtle tremors of overconfidence in those who believed themselves above me, knowing that when the moment came, everything would fall into place exactly as I had designed it. I remembered the early days after we had moved into our first apartment, a modest unit above a small shipping office, where the smell of cardboard and diesel lingered long after the last truck had left. Claire had been beside me, sorting bills on the kitchen table, her hair pulled back loosely, a pencil tucked behind her ear as she calculated our expenses. Those nights were filled with laughter, small victories, and the feeling that we were building something together. Every corner of that apartment held a memory of teamwork, of shared purpose, of quiet ambition. I could recall the nights spent making spreadsheets on my laptop while she annotated them with her own observations, checking each number twice, debating every route and cost, caring not only for the business, but for the integrity of what we were building. It had been a partnership of equals then, one defined by effort, respect, and patience, and I had believed it would last forever. Over time, as our company expanded, I took the back seat, letting the structure stand on its own, knowing that each decision I made in those early years had created a foundation solid enough to withstand even the sharpest scrutiny. Claire moved up in her career, growing confident and admired, and I was proud, but I noticed the subtle shifts. The way she laughed at other people's jokes more than mine, the way she leaned toward those with flashy titles and shiny suits, and the slight impatience whenever I offered advice she thought was too cautious. I did not begrudge her ambition. Ambition was necessary. What I observed was the change in alignment, the gradual shift of loyalty from the partnership we had forged to appearances and social currency. In that moment, seated across from her in the Blackstone ballroom, with the soft murmur of conversation and the delicate clinking of crystal glasses, I recognized how far that shift had traveled. The person she laughed with, Bradley, represented the world she had chosen over the quiet stability I had provided. He was loud, confident in the wrong ways, relying on showmanship rather than substance, and she celebrated that display as if it were a measure of worth. I watched the flicker of recognition in the eyes of other guests, their smiles polite but expectant, waiting for me to respond, to react, to give some signal that the imbalance mattered. I remained composed. My hands rested lightly on the table, one tracing the seam of the linen, the other adjusting my cufflink, and in that small set of actions, I anchored myself. I had rehearsed restraint as a skill, the ability to observe fully before acting, to gather all necessary information, and to allow the flow of events to demonstrate character without interference. The warmth of the ballroom, the soft illumination from the chandeliers, and the murmured conversations around me became background, details that might distract someone unprepared, but I noticed everything. The tilt of Claire's head, the pace of Bradley's speech, the direction of their laughter, all minor yet telling. I recalled the phone calls I had quietly monitored, the internal memos and confidential reports I had studied over the last month, the subtle inconsistencies that suggested how dependent the corporate hierarchy had become on complacency and assumptions. Each piece, cataloged and assessed, painted a picture of the room that no one else could see. Claire's expression, polished and precise, concealed her recognition that the balance of power was not as she believed. The laughter that filled the air, intended to mark me as secondary, instead acted as a lens, revealing the hierarchy and vulnerabilities I could exploit. I felt a steady confidence settle into my chest, a calm awareness that while they performed their roles, I had been constructing a response over decades, assembling it quietly, methodically, and now poised for precise execution. Nothing needed to be said aloud. Silence, observation, and a deep understanding of the patterns of behavior present would suffice to tilt the eventual outcome. I sipped the water at my place setting, noting the subtle reflections in the crystal glass, the way light caught on Claire's jewelry, and the minute tension in Bradley's posture, each detail a signal to the plan I had cultivated. The room moved around me, but I was steady, a constant in a sea of expectation, knowing that when the time came, the structure I had built quietly over the years would reveal itself fully, and the position of everyone in the room would change without a single raised voice or dramatic confrontation. Patience, precision, and a clear mind were my allies, and I let those qualities guide me as the evening unfolded, ensuring that every observed action, every reaction, and every misstep by those around me would be integrated into the strategy one had been preparing for years. Over the years, I had learned to recognize the subtle indicators that revealed true intent beneath surface behavior. As I observed Claire and Bradley moving through the room, speaking to colleagues with ease and confidence, I cataloged every gesture, every tone, every fleeting glance. Claire had become skilled at navigating social hierarchies, and her laughter was now a carefully calibrated tool, designed to maintain appearances and affirm alliances. She had mastered this dance, unaware that the man she once knew intimately had been quietly building a foundation beyond the reach of casual observation. I recalled the early mornings in the warehouse, the meticulous oversight of shipments, the long hours negotiating contracts and securing partnerships that would later form the backbone of a national network. Those experiences had instilled in me a precise understanding of leverage, timing, and influence, knowledge that allowed me to anticipate reactions, measure confidence, and predict outcomes with accuracy. I noted the way Bradley gestured toward the buffet, the subtle shift in Claire's posture as she responded, the practiced manner in which she tilted her head to appear amused. These details, seemingly insignificant, formed a lattice of insight that guided my calculations. The jazz music played softly, a soundtrack to the layers of observation unfolding in my mind. I could track the movement of each person in the room as if they were pieces on a chessboard, each step, each expression, each conversation a potential point of leverage or miscalculation. I thought back to our shared years, the projects we had undertaken together, and the trust that had once defined our collaboration. That trust had been eroded slowly, imperceptibly, as ambition, social expectation, and the desire for validation outside our partnership took precedence. Yet, in that erosion lay the blueprint of opportunity. I focused on the details of the room itself, the layout of tables, the placement of chairs, the positioning of light fixtures and reflective surfaces, every element contributing to the clarity with which I could read the room. A subtle adjustment in my posture, the steadying of my hands, allowed me to project calm without effort, while internally I cataloged the possibilities for action. Each exchange between Claire and Bradley, every laugh and nod, was a note in a symphony that I had been composing in silence, arranging the dynamics so that the eventual revelation of control would be undeniable. I reflected on the times I had quietly reviewed financial statements, legal agreements, and operational reports, identifying points of influence, structural weaknesses, and hidden levers that could be engaged at the precise moment. That preparation, unseen by all, was now poised to intersect with the very scenario that had been unfolding for hours: the performance, the laughter, and the assumptions of everyone present. I sipped water slowly, observing the reflection of light on the crystal glass, noting the micro-expressions of surrounding colleagues, each one revealing the extent of their confidence and, conversely, their vulnerability. In my mind, I traced the sequence of events I would follow, the careful deployment of evidence, authority, and timing that would allow me to realign the dynamics of the evening without raising my voice or breaking composure. Patience was central. Action too soon would squander advantage. Observation, calculation, and restraint had always defined my approach, and in this setting, they would serve once again. The ballroom, rich with detail and activity, became a controlled environment in which I could measure every factor, assess every variable, and prepare for the eventual moment when the carefully stacked assumptions of Claire, Bradley, and the other guests would shift, revealing the depth of my preparation and the presence of my quiet authority. I allowed the natural flow of conversation to continue around me, letting laughter and casual commentary fill the space while internally, I mapped the potential pathways and outcomes, noting which individuals might hesitate, which might overreach, and which would serve to illustrate the full impact of the eventual realignment. Time seemed to dilate, every second stretching to accommodate the simultaneous layers of perception, memory, and projection that guided my attention. I recalled that the most powerful actions were often those that appeared effortless, invisible to those whose expectations constrained them. By maintaining composure, recording details, and integrating knowledge gained over decades, I positioned myself to execute a series of steps that would, when revealed, demonstrate the true structure of authority, competence, and control that had been quietly built and carefully maintained. Each micro-interaction became a point of potential leverage, each observed smile, laugh, or gesture a key to understanding the hierarchy and behavioral patterns present. And in that understanding lay the capacity to influence, redirect, and ultimately reshape the evening according to a plan cultivated through experience, foresight, and strategic patience. The soft hum of conversation around me blended with the distant notes of jazz that seemed to float lazily from the corner of the ballroom, creating a backdrop that encouraged distraction yet could not pull my attention from the details I had so meticulously cataloged. Claire adjusted her posture, leaning slightly closer to Bradley, her smile practiced and flawless, the way someone smiles when they are fully aware of the social dynamics they are manipulating. Every glance she shared with him, every brief tilt of her head, was another piece of data, a clue to her priorities and the assumptions she had built over months of interaction. I noted the subtle tightening of her fingers on the stem of her champagne glass, the micro-expression that betrayed amusement at the expense of decorum, and I cataloged it as part of the larger pattern that had become increasingly clear over the last few weeks. Bradley continued to speak, loud enough to reach the edges of the room, repeating a joke he had told earlier, confident that repetition cemented superiority in the minds of his audience. The men around him nodded, the women smiled, some with polite attention, some with genuine mirth, none of them aware that every gesture, every laugh, was being mapped in my mind for eventual reconciliation with reality. I observed the movement of waiters gliding past, their trays balanced perfectly, each serving choreographed to the expectations of high society, yet oblivious to the tension quietly building at the center of the room. In the past, I had learned that such moments, though seemingly ordinary, held immense potential for revelation when approached with preparation and patience. My hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, fingertips brushing the textured linen as I considered the sequence of events that would allow me to bring clarity to the misperceptions, to subtly introduce consequences without spectacle, ensuring that every action would reinforce the underlying principles I had cultivated over years. Claire's laughter punctuated the rhythm of the room, drawing attention to Bradley's words, and for an instant, I felt the echo of the early years we had shared, when laughter had been mutual, encouraging, and a signal of shared accomplishment rather than alignment with ambition divorced from partnership. I reminded myself that patience was not passive. It was an active, deliberate engagement with the flow of information, a way to accumulate insight while maintaining the appearance of calm. My eyes traced the line of sight between Bradley and the others, noting how each guest positioned themselves physically and emotionally in response to perceived hierarchy and influence. Every movement, every glance, every micro-gesture added to the mental map I maintained, and in doing so, I constructed a framework that would guide the actions necessary to align reality with the knowledge I held. The soft clink of silverware and the subtle shift of light from the chandeliers became reference points, allowing me to gauge timing, focus attention, and anticipate reactions. I recalled the strategic planning sessions with Marcus Bell, the review of corporate documents, the subtle adjustments made to agreements and acquisitions, all conducted quietly, unseen, yet cumulatively powerful. That work provided leverage that I would exercise when the moment was precise, with maximum clarity and minimal resistance. As the evening continued, I observed a pattern emerging. Claire's confidence relied on performance, on the projection of social dominance and alignment with those she considered influential. Bradley's loudness and charm served to reinforce that perception. Yet beneath that surface, the structure of authority, the legal and corporate frameworks I had quietly secured, remained intact and responsive only to me. I sipped the water in front of me, noting the delicate reflection of the chandelier on the crystal, considering the precise sequence by which I would reveal the underlying control without disrupting the natural flow of the room prematurely. The laughter, the gestures, the carefully constructed social dynamics all served as indicators, confirming assumptions, providing confirmation that the preparations I had made were sufficient. Every detail, from the placement of chairs to the trajectory of conversation, contributed to a mental blueprint that I could navigate without error. I allowed the evening to proceed, letting others act according to their perceptions while I maintained complete awareness of the variables, the timing, and the mechanisms that would allow for the subtle, yet absolute, restoration of balance. Each second stretched, each gesture observed, each micro-expression recorded, reinforcing the calm certainty that guided my presence, ensuring that when the moment of revelation arrived, it would unfold with maximum effect, seamless execution, and undeniable clarity, shifting the understanding of everyone in the room without ever raising my voice or compromising the composure that had been my greatest advantage. Bradley finally made the mistake I had been waiting for, not because it was louder than the others, but because it pulled the right person into the wrong conversation. He lifted his champagne glass toward Richard Hayes, the chief executive officer of Meridian East, and said, with a smile sharp enough to cut through every polite mask at the table, that maybe the company could find me a job directing traffic in the parking garage so I could tell people I worked somewhere important too. The table laughed again, but this time the sound did not roll over me. It stopped at the surface. It had reached the edge of its usefulness. Claire looked at me with that tight little smile she used when she wanted me to accept embarrassment as the price of keeping her comfortable. Her eyes said, "Do not ruin this for me." Bradley's eyes said, "Entertain us." Richard's eyes said something else entirely. For the first time that evening, the man looked directly at me, not past me, not through me, but at me, and I saw recognition pass across his face like a shadow crossing a clean white wall. It lasted less than a second, but I had spent too many years reading boardrooms to miss it. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. His smile faded by a fraction. A man who had ignored emails, delayed reports, and dismissed warnings had suddenly remembered the name attached to the firm that now held the keys to his future. I set my water glass down with care. The sound was small, almost swallowed by the music, but it steadied the space around me. I did not look at Bradley. Men like him feed on attention, and I had no intention of giving him more than he had already taken from himself. I looked at Richard. The room was still warm, still glowing under chandeliers, still dressed in velvet voices and polished silver, but something had shifted beneath it. The floor had not moved. The foundation had. I said, "Richard, I gave your board 90 days to clean this place up. You chose not to." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. They landed with the clean weight of a signed document. Bradley's smile froze first. Claire blinked as if she had heard a sentence in a language she almost understood. Someone near the end of the table stopped laughing halfway through a breath. Richard lowered his glass until it rested against the white tablecloth, and the base left a faint ring of moisture behind, a small, ordinary mark in an extraordinary silence. Claire let out a short laugh, brittle and uncertain. "Ethan," she said, "what are you doing? Not what do you mean? Not how do you know him? What are you doing?" As if the problem was my behavior, not the truth pressing against the walls. I turned toward her slowly. For years, I had listened to that tone in kitchens, in parking lots, at holiday dinners, at events where she introduced me with less pride than she used to describe a new pair of shoes. I had accepted it because marriage teaches a man to make room for seasons. But some seasons are not weather. Some are warnings. I looked back at Richard before the ache could soften my voice. "You received the compliance summary on March 3rd. Marcus Bell sent the second notice on April 17th. Your board acknowledged receipt on April 22nd. You signed the delay request yourself." The silence deepened until even the jazz seemed to pull back. Richard's face changed in layers. First irritation, then calculation, then the pale, controlled fear of a man realizing the room had become smaller than his title. Bradley pushed out a laugh, but it came out wrong, thin and uncertain. He said I was speaking nonsense, that I must have picked up corporate phrases from Claire, that this was what happened when insecure husbands wanted attention. A few people looked down. Nobody laughed this time. That was when a woman in a charcoal suit approached from the far side of the ballroom. I had noticed her earlier near the entrance, speaking quietly with hotel staff, a leather folder tucked under one arm. Her name was Evelyn Porter, an independent director appointed during the acquisition process, calm, exact, and incapable of wasting a word. She stopped beside my chair, gave me a brief nod, and said, "Mr. Walker, the board packet is ready when you are." There are moments when a room does not go silent all at once. It empties sound by sound. A fork touches a plate and does not move again. A laugh dies in someone's throat. A chair creaks, then stills. Claire's hand slipped from Bradley's sleeve. Bradley looked at Evelyn, then at Richard, then at me, searching the room for someone willing to tell him this was a misunderstanding. Richard did not rescue him. That was the first honest thing he had done all night. Claire's face lost its polished brightness, and beneath it I saw confusion, then anger, then something closer to fear, not fear of me, but fear of what she had failed to see. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket, and the simple act changed the geometry of the table. For most of the evening, I had been seated below their assumptions. Standing did not make me taller by much, maybe 6 feet in shoes, but authority has never depended on height. It depends on who holds the truth when everyone else has been performing. I looked at Bradley at last. His confidence had nowhere to stand. Then I looked at Claire, and for one quiet second, I wished she had chosen differently before the room forced her to understand. I said, "I did not come here as your guest tonight. I came here because this company becomes my responsibility at midnight." The boardroom packet lay on the table in front of me, bound in dark leather with brass corners catching the light from the chandeliers above. The documents contained everything, organized precisely, each piece of data, each record, each memorandum folded into place like the cogs of a well-oiled machine. I began with the operational review, outlining the inefficiencies introduced over the past quarter, the deliberate mismanagement that had gone unchecked because of assumptions about authority and influence. I spoke clearly, evenly, letting my voice carry over the soft murmur of the remaining guests, who were now fully aware that their laughter earlier had been premature. Each point I made was a direct reflection of what had been occurring behind the scenes, every deviation and misstep, noted with specificity. Claire's face shifted as I moved through the report, her posture stiffening, fingers tightening around the stem of her glass, the practiced mask of control beginning to crack. Bradley shifted in his chair, trying to maintain a confident smile, but the subtle tremor in his hands betrayed his rising awareness that the evening had changed course irrevocably. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject emotion into the facts. The truth was sufficient, precise, and unyielding. I traced each department's budgetary inconsistencies, internal transfers that violated policy, and performance reports that had been selectively presented to the board. With each page turned, I emphasized the conclusions without embellishment, letting the implications speak for themselves. A hush fell across the room as attention sharpened. Guests leaned forward, some with curiosity, others with the discomfort of witnessing an unexpected shift in power dynamics. Claire's eyes darted to Richard, seeking reassurance, but found only measured attention, a recognition that the structure she had relied upon was not as it had appeared. I moved to the legal and contractual files, displaying agreements that had secured the controlling interest of the company, investments made quietly, deliberately, without spectacle, now revealed with context and timing to maximize clarity. Each signature, each clause, each timestamp became evidence of preparation, diligence, and authority that had been silently maintained, unseen by those who assumed my insignificance. The pattern of mismanagement and assumption was clear, the oversight gaps precisely what allowed for a smooth intervention, and I guided the room through the findings methodically, letting the facts stand as pillars, holding the weight of revelation without the need for dramatic flourish. Claire's breath caught at several points, the subtle shifts in her composure noticeable to anyone trained to observe. Bradley's confident posture collapsed incrementally, a quiet acknowledgement that he had overstepped, that the assumptions of dominance he had relied upon were no longer valid. The remaining members of the board, those who had deferred to appearances, now faced the undeniable weight of documented reality, the silent but absolute control embedded in the portfolio and agreements I had constructed. I concluded with the strategic outcomes, the alignment of responsibility and accountability, clearly delineating the transition of authority and the consequences for oversight failure. The room remained silent, not from fear, but from recognition. Each person understood that the shift had occurred without spectacle, without confrontation, and yet with an impact more profound than any argument or raised voice could have delivered. Claire looked at me once more, her lips parted as if to speak, but the words did not come. She understood, finally, that the quiet man at the table, the one who had been underestimated, had orchestrated the evening with precision, ensuring that control, responsibility, and authority now reflected reality rather than perception. I allowed a single, measured nod to acknowledge the transition, then let the room breathe, its members digesting the clarity that had been delivered. The evening's rhythm, once dictated by laughter and social performance, had shifted, anchored by the undeniable structure I had quietly built, and for the first time, the balance in the room aligned with the truth, precise, controlled, and irreversible. The evening had reached a stillness that was almost tangible, a quiet settling over the room that made every subtle sound echo with significance. Claire and Bradley sat across the table, their earlier confidence diminished, replaced by the uneasy awareness that the assumptions they had built upon were no longer valid. Richard Hayes shifted in his chair, reviewing the documents I had presented, his expression revealing the weight of responsibility finally understood, the reality of authority and control laid bare, without embellishment. I did not speak again immediately. I allowed the silence to stretch, letting each individual process the clarity and precision of the information that had been revealed. Every detail, every calculation, every recorded oversight and procedural misstep had converged into a sequence that could not be disputed, only acknowledged. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, her polished composure faltering, a signal to me that the perception of control she had relied upon was no longer intact. Bradley shifted in his seat, trying to regain the performance of dominance he had maintained throughout the evening. But the foundation he had assumed was secure had already been redirected, recalibrated by the quiet authority I had established over years of preparation. The boardroom, once filled with laughter and casual chatter, now held a measured stillness, the kind that encourages reflection and reveals the truth of structural relationships. I rose slowly from my chair, smoothing the front of my jacket, a subtle movement that shifted the geometry of the space without effort, signaling that the next phase of the evening was about to commence. Evelyn Porter, the independent director, handed me the signed copies of the transition documents with a nod that conveyed mutual understanding, her presence a silent affirmation that the procedural steps were in place, and that the authority I had quietly accumulated would now be exercised with precision. I addressed the room calmly, outlining the next steps for alignment of responsibilities, the reassignment of oversight, and the reinforcement of accountability measures, each sentence deliberate, concise, and measured. Claire listened, absorbing the information without interruption, yet her posture betrayed the realization that the structures she had relied upon for status and influence were now out of reach. Bradley attempted a brief interjection, a last attempt to reclaim the narrative, but it faltered against the precision of the presentation, each point carefully anticipated and addressed before it could disrupt the flow of clarity. I concluded the explanation with a statement of finality, detailing the implementation of governance and operational control, and stepped back, allowing the facts to occupy the room without additional commentary. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was comprehension, an acknowledgement of authority quietly executed and fully recognized. Claire's gaze met mine, and in that brief exchange, I saw recognition, a mixture of understanding, frustration, and the dawning awareness of consequences that had been silently building for years. The evening had transformed from a social gathering into a demonstration of control, influence, and meticulous preparation, executed with the precision that years of quiet diligence afford. I remained composed, allowing the room to settle, each individual now aware that the balance of power had shifted without spectacle, without dramatics, and yet with complete clarity. The chandeliers reflected softly on the polished wood surfaces, the light catching the edges of folders and documents, reinforcing the meticulous order that underpinned the evening's revelations. I stepped toward the exit, glancing once more at Claire, who sat quietly, understanding at last the true measure of the man she had underestimated, and I walked away from the table, leaving the room to absorb the reality I had quietly orchestrated, the final alignment of authority, accountability, and consequence now established beyond dispute.